So I am Eleanor Powers. I am co-founder and director of programming for Harvard Alumni for Climate and the Environment. For those of you who are not familiar with HACE, HACE was founded in the spring of 2020 and is the only university-wide organization that's focused on climate and the environment. We have programming that's aimed at educating, providing community, and supporting action. If you're not currently a member, I urge you to join us, so please use the link that we'll have posted in the chat. Today, we are honored to be joined by Harvard College class of 77 classmates, David Gardiner and Peter Dunn, who will be presenting on taking personal climate action. This is the second in a series on the topic. David Gardiner is president of environmental consulting firm David Gardiner and Associates, which focuses on climate change and clean energy issues and advises nonprofit and for-profit organizations. Prior to founding his firm, he served in the Clinton administration as executive director of the White House Climate Change Task Force, and as assistant administrator for policy at the EPA. Prior to joining the EPA, Mr. Gardiner was with the Sierra Club's legislative director in Washington, D.C. Peter has spent his career in general management of companies in the food and healthcare sectors. Most recently, he co-founded Activate Healthcare, which provides primary care for employees and family members within employers and organizations. Peter is now focused on initiatives to support individual action on climate change and is an executive fellow with the Higher Ambition Leadership Alliance. So today, Peter and David will help us to understand how we can take personal action to decrease our carbon footprint and have an impact on others through policy and investing. We've reserved some time for breakout groups at the end and to solicit your feedback on areas of interest in further programming. So now, without taking any more time away from our presentation, it is my enormous pleasure to welcome David Gardiner, who is going to start off the presentation. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Eleanor. And thanks everybody for being here today. It's great. We'd like to start with this reminder that about why it's important that we're all here. We are the first generation to feel the effect of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it. So we are at the crossroads of climate change. Since Peter and I graduated from Harvard, carbon emissions have doubled, and that's not something that we can necessarily be all proud about. We have to think about how to reduce our emissions very substantially over the course of the next nearly 30 years by 2050 and get them down to as close to zero as we possibly can. So this is a little bit about how we're going to walk through how we can make an important difference on climate change, both by reducing our footprints. I'm going to start with a little discussion about the overall problem, how climate change threatens us as we know it, which I suspect has brought many of you here today, but most importantly, how we can take action to limit climate change to the 1.5 degree increase in global warming temperatures contained in the Paris Climate Agreement. Peter's going to talk a little bit about personal actions that affect about 40% of climate change, and a little bit about climate collective action. And I'm going to do a little bit later on about policy and how that can make a difference. And then we're going to turn to all of you in breakout groups and gathering your input in a variety of ways. So to start with, this chart gives a broad indication about looking globally at the problem. Those big red bars right there, particularly the one at the top, look at future pathways of emissions, particularly the big one at the top, which is focused on growing emissions, potentially growing a lot. As indicated there, it's kind of the disaster scenario. Emissions really grow a lot, and as you can read the fine print there, that leads to an increase in global temperatures of something on the order of 4+ degrees Celsius. That's the disaster scenario, which has a lot of unpleasant impacts, big reductions in crop yields, mass extinctions, rising oceans, and so on and so forth. Moving down from that top bar, we see some alternative emissions and heat pathways. The next one down, the one that is labeled 2.7 or 3.1 degrees Celsius, is basically the emissions pathway that we expect now because of policies which countries around the globe have adopted. So good news is that we're not on the disaster pathway at the moment. We've actually made some good progress. The sort of much narrower line below that, the 2.4 degree centigrade level, is the emission reductions that we would expect to see if all of the pledges that individual countries have made to reduce their emissions were actually realized. Those pledges are typically just that. They're a pledge. They are not necessarily backed up with real policies and other things that might actually lead to achievement of them. So there's an important goal there of turning commitments into real action. And then finally, at the bottom, the last two, the 2 degrees centigrade and the 1.5 degrees centigrade, are levels that we really want to get to. Actually, the Paris Agreement that was negotiated in 2015 includes both targets. 2 degrees centigrade was thought to be a level that would be reasonable to achieve with relatively small impact. 1.5 degrees centigrade is obviously even a less risky scenario with more manageable impacts. So again, good news here. We're not on the disaster pathway. Not so great news. We've got a fair amount of work to do to get ourselves on the pathway that we really want to be on. So now shifting a little bit into the more detail about where do those emissions come from. This is again an examination of those emissions on a global basis. There's a total of 59 gigatons. I know it's hard to imagine that, but I think what's important on this chart is the relative weight of those things. So that electricity sector, the first on the left there, responsible for the biggest chunk of all those emissions, 24 gigatons. That's out of the electricity sector. The industry sector, also a big source at 12 gigatons. Agriculture, transportation, and nature are all important sources. Nature, just to clarify, largely as a result of deforestation or disruptions that we make to soils that all release greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So there are lots of roadmaps out there that would say, here's how we should tackle climate change and reduce emissions to get there. This was one that we took from a book called Speed and Scale by John Doerr, and again, gives you sort of a relative sense of how we might tackle reducing those 59 gigatons of emissions right back down to zero by 2050. So electrifying transportation, an important tool. Again, decarbonizing the electricity grid, by far and away the biggest and most important thing to do. Fixing food, protecting nature, cleaning up industry, and removing carbon, about which I'll say a little bit more in a minute or two. So really lots of opportunities there. Here's another way to think about it. What you see here on these charts is, on the left, the bar that says what we were doing in 2015. 85% of our energy came from non-renewable sources, emitting sources, and 15% from non-emitting and renewable sources. Kind of the base case of what people think would happen by 2050 is that middle bar, where not only would overall energy use increase, we'd increase our renewables a fair amount, almost doubling them as a percentage, but still have an awful lot of non-renewable resources. So what the case is that we want to be on is the right-hand bar here, with 2/3 of our energy coming from renewable sources and a third or less from non-renewable sources. So this is a little bit more detail about what technologies can help us get there. So when we say we're going to do a particular thing, decarbonize a sector or something like that, what do we mean by that? Well, the first thing that we're going to do is we need to double the energy efficiency of everything. That's our hidden secret weapon. And it is hidden because most people, you can't really see energy efficiency, but boy, does it make a big difference. We want to decarbonize electricity, as we talked about. Wind and solar are already very important tools to doing that. There are some decarbonized fuels, which we can talk about in a moment. And I think nuclear energy will play some role. It already does play a role. And I think it's likely to do so in the future, at least to some extent. We want to, as we clean up the electricity grid, we want to electrify as much as we can to replace the use of fossil fuels with that clean electricity. So that means cars and trucks. It means electrifying our buildings, means electrifying as much of industry as we can. There are going to be and are starting to be decarbonized fuels, clean hydrogen. We are able to scrub fossil fuels, in effect, to take the carbon out of it. We can use biofuels or bioenergy, energy that's produced from crops. That's especially going to be important in some hard to decarbonize sectors like airplanes or shipping. You think about a boat that's a big industrial shipping category that's going to be far from any energy source. What do you do about that? Industry can be hard to decarbonize. That'll be important there. As I mentioned, we can scrub carbon, or as it's known technically, to capture and store carbon. In some cases, we can turn that into productive commercial uses, and we're looking for more of those. But that you can take not only the carbon from fossil fuels so that they become virtually zero emitting fuels, but you can also capture carbon from the air itself. And that will be helpful to us as we go forward. In agriculture, we can reduce food waste, meat and dairy consumption, fertilizer overuse, and we can undertake regenerative farming, which, along with activities that we can take in nature, allow us to store more carbon, either by stopping deforestation or planting more trees or storing more carbon in forests and soils. Key thing is that there's no silver bullet here. We need everything, lots of silver buckshot, and we need it, as you saw from the earlier roadmap, across the board. And scale and speed are critical. The clock is ticking, and it's been 45 years since Peter and I graduated from college, and we've got 30 years to really tackle this problem here. I just wanted to provide one example here. This is focused on the United States about how we have to operate at big and unprecedented speed and scale. And really, this is going to take a new industrial revolution. It took us 140 years to build today's electrical grid. In the next 30 years, we've got to build 2 zero-emission US power grids. The first to replace most of today's fossil electricity generation, and the second because we're going to double electricity supply and demand for powering cars, buildings, factories, and the like. So one can look at that as, gosh, that's an impossible task. I think the way Peter and I think about it is a gigantic opportunity to advance a whole new green economy. And that'll be great, not only for the United States, but the globe at large. And so now over to Peter.
Okay. We are now going to talk a little bit about the 40% of climate change that can happen by lowering our personal carbon footprint. Before we head on to the other 60%, it also provides some moral high ground as well as you tackle the advocacy kind of issues if we're walking the talk. So with that, we think about this in sort of 2 big buckets, one of which is your carbon footprint, which you want to make bigger, and the second of which is your personal climate shadow, which you want to make smaller, lower your carbon footprint and increase your climate shadow or your influence on policy and other progress involving others. And those two actions are going to flow directly from, are going to make possible the progress that David talked about that we need earlier. So many of you may know this, but the United States is a very opportunity-rich environment for reducing carbon dioxide emissions. We are roughly, 3 times what France is, and twice what Japan is, and those are 2 very civilized societies. So there's a really significant opportunity for us to make progress, and not to mention the developing world, which is at significantly lower levels. Our personal emissions tend to come from primarily, number one is home heating, cooling, and other related activities. The second big thing is transportation. Third is things you buy, and fourth is food. And so there's an opportunity in each of those 2 categories. A lot of people who are concerned about climate focus on things like recycling and other kind of composting and other activities, which are really good and important things to do. And the real difference to be made is in the infrastructure of your home and or transportation. And so we're excited about trying to engage people in that where the opportunity is. So here's an example of in the United States of the thousands of pounds per person of carbon that could be reduced from various actions. And the ones highlighted in greens are all the ones that are over 1,000 pounds per year. So basically replacing your electrical powering source, either with solar panels or some version of green electricity, potentially through your utility, is the big one. That's 18,000 pounds. The next big one is electric vehicles. And then you're into kind of a horse race between hot water, home battery, heat pumps, for water, road and reducing travel, and recycling and lowering your and eating lower down on the food chain. This is just describing those same elements visually, so you can see that getting to green electricity is kind of the home run. The doubles and triples are around transportation and of various forms, and then other elements of your home infrastructure. Now we're going to turn a little bit to collective action and talk about the kinds of things that we can do, not only to personally make an impact with our footprint, but to influence others. We talk about this really in 3 different components, one of which is aligning investments. The second of which is to talk about climate solutions. I'll say more about that in a minute. And the third of which is advocating for policy change. On the investment front, David talked about the enormous opportunity that exists for supporting the industrial revolutions that can and need to and will most likely will take place in the next 10 to 30 years. And what's interesting is that Morgan Stanley is actually saying that sustainable equity funds that are focusing on those kind of green investments are already outperforming their non-sustainable peers. The kinds of things that people can talk about is that you can actually ask for funds and initiatives that are sustainable, responsible, and impact. Literally, when you talk with an investment advisor, you can mention these kind of categories, and they have multiple opportunities for guiding you to investments in that space. There's also ESG, environmental, social, and governance, is another kind of category of investing that most financial firms can direct you to. And the third is impact investing, which is more specifically focused on sectors. Those also exist on mutual funds. So if you're not working with an investment advisor and want to go directly to mutual funds, there are climate-focused ETFs, green bonds, et cetera. And then finally, if you want to really dig in, and find specific opportunities in clean energy, water, farming, food tech, et cetera. These are all places that are likely to experience growth as the economy shifts into other directions. And by moving your funds actively away from things that are destroying the economy, our future around fossil fuels, and moving them toward this way, you're both shifting the funds that are needed to make the transition and also creating the possibility of an exceptional return. The next part is about talking, and this is this is from some statistics from Catherine Hayhoe, a well-regarded climate scientist who's also done a lot of work on the communication space. And here are a couple of key facts. 70% of Americans are worried about climate change. 65% of Americans do not talk about climate change. 50% of Americans feel hopeless, and only about 8% of Americans feel activated on climate change. That's what this gap between the people who are concerned and the people who are activated is part of what David and I are trying to gear up on, which is how do we start to create concrete examples of tools. This presentation is an overview. We hope going forward, start digging in and sharing specifics around each of these categories and subcategories. But in terms of communication, no major revolution takes place without people talking about it. And the silence is deafening and is a threat to our future. Now, the question is, there are reasons people are not talking. How do you overcome those? Which goes to the next slide. As George Marshall said, the goal of the conversation is not to tell people of climate change, it's to expand the number of people in the conversation we're talking about it. Catherine does a really lovely job talking about how to, in our sometimes politically charged environment, how do you enter into this conversation in a way that's going to be productive and make progress? And she talks about the idea that we have a lot of things in common. Some people care about fishing, some people care about boating, some people care about their grandchildren. Everyone has kind of specific things that are all going to be affected by climate change. And if you tie this topic to topics that people care about, you're more likely to have a productive conversation. Also, if you focus on solutions, because if you're saying, hey, we can make great progress, we can create economic value, and take care of the people and things that we love and care about, that creates the opportunity. One thing I found moving about her work is she's actually created a pretty strong community among the religious right, which under kind of a right to life kind of act for future generations. And that's actually getting some traction in some places that's meaningful. That's an example of how to look for a common ground. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David to talk some more about policy, which will lead to advocacy, and off you go, David.
Great, thanks, Peter. So yes, advocating for policy can also make a big difference. Policy is already making a big difference, and the goals here are to make the clean technologies inexpensive and easy, and the dirty technologies expensive and hard. We've got a fabulous success story already, which I'll elaborate further on in the wind and solar arena. And we basically want to replicate that for as many low and zero carbon technologies as we possibly can. And then for on the notion of making the dirty technologies more expensive, we want to remove carbon subsidies and internalize the cost of carbon, or in other ways, think about how the polluter can pay for the pollution they're putting into the atmosphere and not the rest of us. So as I mentioned, there's this wonderful success story starting here with solar. What you're looking at is a chart of the price of solar photovoltaic panels on average around the globe. And you can see, since just a little bit after Peter and I graduated from college in 1983, we have brought the price of solar energy down dramatically. And so it is now competitive with that blue line there, which is the price of natural gas. And so that's a very important and powerful thing. It says one does not pay a price for installing solar energy versus natural gas. If we were to put coal on here, solar beats coal by a mile. So this is exactly the huge success story, and as you'll hear in a minute, part of why we're achieving such good results. We've got similar results on the wind side of things. So this is looking at windmills that are happen on land, and again, big price drop since 1983, making wind on average beating at least of 2015, and I think the numbers are still correct today, beating natural gas. So the cheapest path to clean electricity is with wind and solar at the moment, and it's something, it's critical to decarbonizing the electricity grid, and we just need to keep going on this. And again, it's a huge success story and gives us a lot of confidence that we know how to tackle climate change because we're already doing it in this one area. And as you'll see in the next slide, which is looking actually at batteries. So batteries will be critical to not only electrifying our transportation fleet, but may be really helpful to using wind and solar, which of course don't operate all the time. So if you have excess electricity that you're generating when the wind's blowing and the sun's out, you want to save it in a battery and use it when you need it. And here you see exactly the same sort of pathway that we've seen on wind and solar, big price drops in the cost of batteries. And hopefully that curve will keep on going down further, making electric vehicles and batteries less expensive over time. So how'd we do that? Well, it was really with an integrated set of government policies that, particularly for wind and solar, have made a difference. Originally, actually, it was NASA that was investing in things like solar. The Defense Department has done a lot of investing, and of course, so too has the Energy Department with research and development. And there's been a big scale up in the last couple of years in funding for research and development activities across the federal government so we could get at more technologies. We had a whole set of incentives, both at the federal level, typically with tax incentives for wind and solar, or requirements that states had that utilities had to buy more wind and solar. And those two things not only drove more purchases of wind and solar, but as we scaled up the use of wind and solar, we learned how to make the price drop, partly because it was simply at scale, but you also learn things about where there are costs that you can get rid of, and we become more efficient, and that's helped to drive the reduction in price. And that has led to big results. Again, here in the United States, we had a record amount of wind and solar installed in 2021, an amount equal to 70 conventional power plants. So that's a big number, really impressive kind of scale. We've reduced power sector emissions about 35% since 2005, and wind and solar are definitely playing a part there. But one of the things that's also become a big driver is that there are hundreds of companies now that have pledged to buy 100% clean energy, meaning buying wind and solar. And they've done that in part because the price is low. And they realize that for them, it's a better business deal to get the cheap electricity. And they also like the clean benefits and know that their customers or investors like the clean energy. But it's an impressive kind of added push that is now coming from the private sector to scale up wind and solar. So that's what we need to be doing more of. And just a final point here is that federal advocacy can happen at any level of government. Of course, a lot of us think about the federal government, and there's a lot of attention paid to it. And as I mentioned, to the federal government, especially in the last year plus 2 years almost of the Biden administration, have increased research and development funding, adopted new tax incentives, created funding for new clean infrastructure like electric vehicle charging. The Biden administration has a new order out about buying products, which the federal government does in very large quantities. So there are important things that the federal government can do, but states often can get there faster and move more quickly than the federal government does. They've established, as I mentioned, standards for electricity and in some cases gas and emissions from them. They can also fund clean infrastructure, and all governments at every level buy things. So buying clean cement, steel, all those kinds of things can be helpful. And the same thing can happen at the local level. Cities, counties have significant clout. They buy electricity, they buy other things, but they also have, as do other governments, authority to do things. They could put together a charging plan for electric vehicles. They have regulatory authority to ensure that buildings are efficient or clean in whatever way through the building codes that they establish. So advocacy can happen at, and needs to happen actually, at every level of government, and there are opportunities everywhere. So Peter, back to you.
Okay, so as we've indicated, this is hopefully the beginning of a conversation. This is the beginning of a conversation, and we want to understand how you want to participate. And so we're going to have this conversation in 3 different ways. The first is breakout groups. The next will be some group polling, and then a very quick close. So we're going to put ourselves in breakout groups in just a few minutes, and the 2 questions that we're going to be asking are, what do you care about that motivated you to be in this room or on this call? And the next question is, what have you done or do you envision doing on this topic? If you're a newcomer, that's great. So you can focus on the future. And there's kind of a, if there's time at the end, maybe a little bit of, hey, what kinds of things might we do together? But the two main questions are, what do you care about that motivated you to be in this room? And what have you done and or do you envision doing on this topic? I'd like to suggest that if each of you could just do a quick screenshot. In fact, I'm going to do the same thing right now. There we go. And I'm also going to put that in a minute as we wrap up in chat, in case you weren't able to do that, so that we remember the questions that we're supposed to talk about. Okay, so next is a couple guidelines. Please keep your webcams on. Use for chat for inputs. If you have technology issues, you can type into chat and we'll try and be helpful. Facilitation steps, we'll spend 10 minutes on each of the 2 questions. We're going to break up into groups of 4 or 5, and we'll need a volunteer, timekeeper, and facilitator in each group. So somebody just step up in each. That's great. The timekeeper will need to set an alarm and notify the group when 5 minutes has passed and then 10 minutes has passed. And for each question, we'll go around the room the first time, get each person to share their point of view in about a minute. And after everyone has talked, if there's still time, we'll open things up. Basically, do what feels right, but that's kind of a potential way to think about it. And one last thought here is that this is an important opportunity to learn and exchange ideas. And one of the best definitions of learning we came across was being altered by what is said, being conscious of both listening and speaking, and looking for kind of a meeting of the minds and searching for ideas and insight. So on that inspirational note, hopefully let's go to the breakout groups. And welcome back, everybody. Are we all here? Laura, are we all back in?
Everyone's back in.
Okay, great. What I'd like to do is to ask, give you guys a minute or 2 to just drop in chat. What did you hear in the breakout groups that was insightful, helpful, meaningful, about the conversation and or the future? So please take a minute, and if each of you could just put in a comment, or at least one comment, that would be great. Or not, that's also great. So We'll give it one more minute. Okay, let's go on to the next topic. So now a little group polling, some learning from this. We'll start with a quick poll regarding your interest in engaging on the impact each of us can make on climate change. And so with that, to you, Laura, for this poll.
Okay. How about I end the poll and share the results?
Okay. All right, that's good. Okay, now to the next question. Hold on, I think I skipped by one. Sorry. Okay, next question is a short poll to understand your interest in ways to reduce your carbon footprint. So we just want to see kind of where your energy is around which of these elements to you might want to explore in the future. Over to you, Laura. I think there are 4 of these. Okay, Laura.
Great.
Yep. Want to share the poll?
There you go.
All right, that's interesting that we a lot of interest in cooling and heating and cooling, transportation, kind of the 2 big ones, but also interested in the others. So that's good. All right, let's go on to the next one, which is a quick short poll to understand your interest in ways to increase your climate shadow. Over to you, Laura.
There you go.
Again, 3 or 4 ideas here. And please make sure you scroll down and see all the numbers 3 and 4. We don't want things to get buried, like investing in others. All right, so let's declare victory here and share results. So it looks like there's interest in national in each of these areas, varying degrees, and connecting with others. That's interesting. Okay, almost towards the end, a quick survey to help us learn about your interest in volunteering to support this effort. People are a little quiet on this one. That's okay.
Should we once again declare victory and move on?
I think we should.
Excellent.
And the last question is poll is a very quick question around your reactions to this session overall. Okay. And that's people appreciate that. And then the last thing I would just say is if there's any comments or suggestions that you want to make in chat, we'd love to get your input as we wrap this up. With that, David, I think we're on to or maybe as we close out, on to close and to you.
I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for participating. It's terrific to have your engagement. For those of you in my group, I really enjoyed the chance to chat with you. But I think the closing thought here is we like this quote from Marshall Saunders, founder of the Citizens Climate Lobby. I used to think that the important people were taking care of the important things. I don't think that anymore. You and I are engaged in a battle for all of life. I don't see anybody else coming. You are the cavalry. We are the cavalry. So hopefully this provided an opportunity to help everybody think about this. And we hope that we can find ways to stay engaged with you going forward from here, because that engagement, as the quote implies, is critical for making success on this big challenge. Thank you all for being a part of this effort.
A pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
You.
Nice
Thanks,
to meet
Peter and David.
everyone.
Thanks everyone for coming.